What if one promise spoken in the dark, whispered between bombs and blood, was all it took to save a life? In every war, there are those who fight, those who flee, and those who wait. But sometimes, there are those who make a promise so powerful, it echoes across decades. This is not just a story of survival. It's the story of two hearts, trapped in a war they never asked for, bound together by fate and by a vow that would change everything. The promise that saved a life amidst the war. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and drying laundry. Somewhere beyond the hills, birds chirped as if unaware that the world teetered on the edge of chaos. In the village of Wellenberg, time seemed to hold its breath. Elena Kremer stood at the window of her grandmother's cottage, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. Her eyes weren't on the flowers blooming in the garden. They were fixed on the distant hills, where rumors said tanks were already rolling. 22, with calloused fingers from helping with field work and soft eyes that had seen too much too young, Elena had grown up listening to stories about war. Now, those stories marched toward her doorstep. Inside, the small radio crackled its voice urgent, strained. German forces advancing eastward. Families are advised to evacuate. All men between 18 and 45 to report to. Elena turned it off. Muty? Her younger brother Jonas called from the back room, his voice trembling. What did they say? She didn't answer immediately. How do you tell a boy of 10 that the world as he knows it is unraveling? Instead, she walked to him, kneeling until they were eye to eye. We're safe for now, she lied softly, but we'll need to be ready, just in case. Jonas blinked rapidly, trying not to cry. The truth was, Elena had already hidden their family papers, stashed dried goods beneath the floorboards, and mapped out escape routes with other villagers. But it wasn't just fear that kept her up at night. It was the knowledge that this time, there was no one coming to save them. Not her father, who died in the last war. Not their mother, taken by fever 2 winters ago. Just her. Just her. And somewhere far away, across another country, a man named Thomas Howell zipped up his uniform for the 5th time that morning. Thomas was 28, a British intelligence translator, trained in code, strategy, and silence. He had a fiancée waiting in Yorkshire, a mother who believed he was stationed safely behind the lines, and a secret he hadn't spoken aloud since the war began. He didn't believe in the war. He believed in people, in moments, in things like letters and laughter and promises whispered in the dark. And though he didn't know it yet, a single promise was about to find him. One that would test everything he thought he knew. One that would make him question duty, sacrifice, and what it really means to save a life. Because fate had already begun its work. And war, like love, doesn't wait for permission. The fog hadn't lifted. The air was heavy with tension. Elena hadn't slept. She had kept herself awake through the long hours, seated near the barn door with the pistol in her lap, alert to every creak and gust of wind. Thomas had dozed lightly in the hay nearby, his breathing steady but never deep. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she had trusted him enough not to shoot. That counted for something. Through the cracks in the barn wall, the sky began to shift. Not light, not dawn, just a dull gray hue that pressed against the horizon, making the world feel smaller. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble echoed tanks, perhaps, or trucks. The war was getting closer. Inside the barn, Jonas stirred in his hiding spot. Elena gently opened the panel, lifting him out. His small arms clung to her neck. His eyes widened when he saw Thomas, now fully awake, sitting up against a beam. Who's that? Jonas whispered. Elena paused. A friend. Just for now. Thomas offered a faint smile, eyes still heavy with exhaustion. Hi there. Jonas squinted at him. You look tired. Thomas chuckled. I am. It was a fragile moment, but in that softness, something unexpected bloomed normalcy. A boy, a sister, a stranger in uniform, sharing a quiet pause before the storm. But war doesn't wait for tenderness. By midday, the village bell rang. Once, then twice, an old signal. Soldiers were coming. Elena's heart thundered. She turned to Thomas. Go. Now. Take the eastern path. Cut through the forest. Thomas stood, already grabbing his pack. What about you? I'll stay. If they search, I'll need to be here. If we both run, they'll know. He hesitated. They might arrest you. Only if they find you. He nodded, jaw tight. Then, as if on instinct, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. A contact. A name. A town farther west. If anything happens to me, he said, pressing it into her hand, this is where the promise lives. Elena stared at it, then back at him. And what if I'm the one who doesn't make it? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he did something else. Something unplanned. He took her hand, squeezed it once, and whispered, leave. Then he ran. The soldiers arrived minutes later. Their boots pounded against cobblestone. Their voices barked orders. The barn was searched. Elena stood still as a statue, while one soldier eyed the floorboards too long. But nothing was found. Jonas clung to her side. Rust flakes from the Luger trembled in her pocket. Then, finally, they left. And Elena collapsed to her knees, not from relief, but from sheer, shaking exhaustion. Somehow, they had survived. But war had only begun testing them. The barn was quiet, save for the sound of Jonas breathing inside the hidden compartment. Thomas sat on a hay bale, dripping mud and sweat, his boots leaving prints on the wooden floor. Elena paced across from him, her lantern casting anxious shadows against the walls. Her pistol still rested within arm's reach. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. It wasn't silence, it was assessment. Finally, Thomas broke it. I won't stay long. Just enough to find my direction. Elena crossed her arms. If someone finds you here, I lose everything. I know, he said, and he meant it. But I didn't come to spy. I was sent to observe a bridge 3 miles from here. Got separated. You expect me to believe that? No, he said simply, but it's the truth. Elena studied him for a long moment. He didn't look like a liar. He looked tired, worn, human. I have a child, she said at last. If they catch me helping an enemy soldier, you won't, he cut in gently, because I'll be gone before sunrise. He stood, slowly, reaching for his coat, but her voice stopped him. Wait. Thomas turned. She hesitated, her breath unsteady. There's a patrol. They check barns at random. Sometimes they ask for papers. He waited. She looked at him, not at his uniform, not at his boots, but at his face. And something shifted. You said you didn't want to die tonight. I meant it. She took a deep breath, then stepped forward. Then you'll hide here, but only until the road clears. A pause. Then, and you'll promise me something. Thomas straightened. What is it? Her eyes didn't flinch. If you get out of this alive, you'll tell someone. What happened here? Not just about me, about this village. What's happening to us? We don't have voices, but maybe someone like you does. Thomas's throat tightened. Of all the things she could have asked, safety, favors, escape, she asked for memory, for truth. I promise, he said. And in the stillness of that barn, beneath cracked beams and war-worn silence, a promise was made, quiet, powerful, unbreakable. The next morning arrived, cloaked in fog and tension. Elena hadn't slept. She had taken the first watch, sitting near the barn door with the pistol in her lap, while Thomas dozed lightly in the hay. She didn't trust him yet. but she had trusted him enough not to shoot. That counted for something. As the sun rose pale and slow over Wellenberg, a faint rumble echoed in the distance. Tanks, perhaps, or trucks. The war was getting closer. Inside the barn, Jonas stirred in his hiding spot. Elena gently opened the panel, lifting him out. His small arms clung to her neck. His eyes widened when he saw Thomas, now fully awake, sitting up against a beam. "Who's that?" Jonas whispered. Elena paused. "A friend, just for now." Thomas offered a faint smile, eyes still heavy with exhaustion. "Hi there." Jonas squinted at him. "You look tired." Thomas chuckled. "I am." It was a fragile moment. But in that softness, something unexpected bloomed normalcy. A boy, a sister, a stranger in uniform, sharing a quiet morning before the storm. But war doesn't wait for tenderness. By mid-afternoon, the village bell rang. Once, then twice. An old signal. Soldiers were coming. Elena's heart thundered. She turned to Thomas. "Go. Now, take the eastern path. Cut through the forest." Thomas stood, already grabbing his pack. "What about you?" "I'll stay. If they search, I'll need to be here. If we both run, they'll know." He hesitated. "They might arrest you. Only if they find you." He nodded, jaw tight. Then, as if on instinct, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. A contact, a name, a town farther west. "If anything happens to me," he said, pressing it into her hand, "this is where the promise lives." Elena stared at it, then back at him. "And what if I'm the one who doesn't make it?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he did something else. Something unplanned. He took her hand, squeezed it once, and whispered, "Live." Then he ran. The soldiers arrived minutes later. Their boots pounded against cobblestone. Their voices barked orders. The barn was searched. Elena stood still as a statue while one soldier eyed the floorboards too long. But nothing was found. Jonas clung to her side. Rust flakes from the Luger trembled in her pocket. Then, finally, they left, and Elena collapsed to her knees, not from relief but from sheer, shaking exhaustion. Somehow, they had survived. But war had only begun testing them. The soldiers didn't return that night, but silence can be louder than sirens. Elena kept close to Jonas, wrapping him in a wool blanket that still smelled faintly of her mother's old soap. He had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from fear and still too young to carry the weight of what they had narrowly escaped. She, however, didn't sleep. Every creak of the barn's frame, every gust of wind pressing against the boards, sounded like footsteps, like boots, like betrayal. By the second day, the village changed. People stopped making eye contact. The baker, once generous with his stale ends, now watched her too long when she passed. An old neighbor who had helped her carry firewood last week turned away when she waved, and whispers sharp, purposeful, clung to her as she moved. Someone knew, or thought they did. And in a village where silence was survival, even a thought could become a sentence. That afternoon, she knocked quietly at Clara's door. The two had grown up together, inseparable as girls. Clara had been there when Elena buried her mother, had held Jonas the day he was born. But when the door opened, Clara didn't smile. "Elena," she said, too flat. Elena glanced over her shoulder. "Can we talk? Inside?" A pause, then a nod. The house smelled of boiled potatoes and damp wood. Clara didn't offer tea, didn't sit. "They're saying things," she began, before Elena could. Clara's voice was thin, controlled. Elena stayed quiet. "That you helped someone, a soldier." Still no answer. Clara stepped closer. "Is it true?" Elena looked into her eyes she had trusted with childhood secrets and tears. It doesn't matter. Clara's jaw tightened. It does to them. Silence. Finally, Elena spoke. Would you turn me in? A long breath. Then soft no. But I'm not the only one who knows. That night, a brick shattered Elena's window. Attached was a piece of paper. No name. Just a single word, scrawled in a shaky hand, traitor. She stood there for a long time, glass crunching beneath her feet, wind biting her arms. In war, danger doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor. Winter came without mercy. The fields around Wellenberg froze into silence, the ground too hard to bury anything hope, fear, or memory. Fires were smaller now, rations thinner, eyes hollower. And yet, Elena wrote. She wrote at night, by candlelight, after Jonas had fallen asleep, her fingers stiff with cold, her breath fogging the paper. She wrote to no one in particular, and to someone very specific. She wrote to Thomas. She didn't know if he was alive. She hadn't heard anything since he disappeared into the trees. No word, no sign. But still, she wrote. Sometimes only a few lines, sometimes pages. She wrote about the snow, about Jonas learning to tie his shoes, about the soldiers, and about the silence between neighbors that grew louder by the day. Then she folded the letters, sealed them in scraps of wax paper, and hid them beneath a loose floorboard beside the old Luger. A growing archive of things unsaid, unread, unknown. She didn't send them. There was nowhere safe to send them to, but writing was a way of surviving. One night, Clara came again. This time, she looked different shaken. Her coat dusted with snow, eyes red, voice trembling. They took Jakob, she whispered. Someone said he had a radio. Elena pulled her inside, locked the door. Clara didn't sit. She just stood there, hugging herself. I think they're watching me now, because of you. The words hung in the air like frost. Elena said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. Clara looked at the floor, then at Elena's hands, still ink-stained from the last letter. What do you write? She asked. Elena hesitated. Then, softly, memories. 3 days later, Jonas brought her a folded note. No stamp, no name. Just scrawled words on torn paper. Stop writing. They know. Elena burned her letters that night. All but one. The last one she buried deeper than the rest. It began, if you're still alive. I kept my promise. The night the soldiers returned, the snow had started again, soft, slow, silent. Elena was chopping wood behind the barn when she heard the boots. Too many to be a patrol. Too quick to be routine. She didn't run. She went to Jonas. He was coloring a scrap of paper by candlelight, humming quietly to himself. She knelt beside him, touched his cheek. Remember what we practiced? He nodded, wide-eyed. Go. Hide. Don't come out unless you hear my voice. Not even if you're scared. Jonas didn't ask questions. He had stopped asking weeks ago. She kissed his forehead and watched him slip into the hidden compartment. Then she stood, turned to face the storm. They kicked the door open. 3 soldiers. No insignias she recognized. Rough, angry, eager. Where is he? One barked. Elena didn't flinch. Who? The British. She blinked slowly. You're late. One struck her sharp, fast, across the face. The world tilted. Her knees buckled, but she didn't fall. They searched the barn, the house, tore pages from her books, ripped open cupboards. They didn't find Jonas. They didn't find Thomas. But they found something else. A letter, the one she hadn't burned. They dragged her outside. Snow fell harder now, swallowing the world in white. The village stood in silence, doors shut, windows dark. No one came to help. No one spoke her name. except one voice, Clara. Elena's cry was raw, desperate, and Clara stood in her doorway. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't look away. That was the answer. Later, in a holding cell that smelled of iron and rot, Elena curled around herself. Her hands ached. Her face throbbed, but she smiled, because they hadn't found Jonas, and that was the only promise she had left to keep. It was almost spring when the camp gates opened. The guards didn't speak. They just pointed toward the horizon, where frost still clung to the earth, but the air had begun to soften. Elena stepped forward, bones aching, clothes hanging loose on her frame. Her body had survived the cell, the interrogations, the hunger. But something inside her had changed forever. She walked for hours, for days. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. And then, just before dusk on the fourth day, she saw it. A farmhouse, familiar, worn, smoke curling from the chimney like a thread tied to memory. She stood at the edge of the woods, afraid to take another step. What if they weren't there? What if someone else lived there now? What if no one remembered her at all? The door opened. Jonas. Older, thinner, but him. He stepped outside slowly, like a shadow stepping into the light. And when he saw her, he didn't move, didn't speak. Elena dropped to her knees. Tears froze on her cheeks. And then finally, he ran to her. Inside, everything had changed, and nothing had. The same loose floorboard, the same smell of dust and wood smoke. But on the table, there were pages, new ones, drawings, words, letters. Jonas had learned to write, and he had written to her. Dozens of letters. None of them had left the house, but they waited. Like he had, Elena slept for 3 days. When she woke, her body still hurt, but her heart had started to beat differently. Slower, stronger. Thomas was still gone. The war was not. But Jonas had survived. And that, she told herself, was enough. The letter arrived on a Monday. No stamp, no signature. Just a sealed envelope, brittle from the cold. Elena found it tucked inside the old grain bin, placed carefully beneath a broken plank. Someone had risked something to get it there. She didn't open it at first. She just stared. The paper felt impossibly heavy in her hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it might contain. Hope, or confirmation, or an end to wondering. She waited until Jonas was asleep. Then, by candlelight, she broke the seal. If this reaches you, then I kept mine too. The handwriting was rough, slanted, but it was his. Thomas. He was alive. He had made it to the town he mentioned in the barn, the place where the promise would live. He had found the contact, survived the mountains, crossed borders, changed names, watched the world fall apart from the outside. And in all that time, he never forgot her. He wrote about hearing whispers of Wellenberg, of soldiers gone rogue, of arrests, of a woman taken and a child left behind. He had looked for them, but the war made everything invisible. Still, he wrote, letter after letter. Most had never reached her. This one had. At the end, there was a single line, if you're still there. I'll be waiting, under the bridge. Elena folded the letter slowly, pressed it to her chest. Then she stood. Outside, the snow had finally melted, and the road was clear. The path to the bridge hadn't changed. Elena walked it like one walks through a dream, half memory, half disbelief. The trees whispered old secrets. The stones remembered footsteps long gone. Jonas stayed behind, watching from the porch. He was older now. He understood things children shouldn't. But he knew when something had to be done alone. Elena wore the same coat she had worn that night the night Thomas ran. Inside the pocket, the Luger remained, still rusted, still silent. But beside it, now, was the letter. The bridge was, as she remembered, stone, cracked by frost and time. Below it, a river too shallow to carry sound, too muddy to carry reflection. And there he was, Thomas, older, scarred, alive. He didn't smile at first, neither did she. They just looked, not as strangers, not as lovers, but as two people who had carried a war inside them, and somehow still stood. Then he took a step forward, and another, and she met him halfway. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. He handed her a photo, a child's drawing, a son, a house, a woman with dark hair, a boy with a red scarf. "I kept it," he said, "the one Jonas gave me, before I left." Elena's voice caught. "He still draws." Thomas nodded. "So do I." He pulled from his coat a small notebook, weathered and soft. Inside sketches, letters, names, pages of what he remembered, what he had promised to remember. Elena touched the pages as if they might vanish. Then she closed the book and whispered, "Let's go home." They walked side by side across the bridge, two survivors, one promise, and a silence full of everything they didn't need to say. Peace came quietly. No parades, no fireworks, just silence, the kind that lingers after too much noise. The village began to breathe again, slow, unsure. Some houses remained empty. Others welcomed ghosts. The markets reopened, though the shelves were never full. Children returned to play, but their laughter carried a weight it never had before. For Elena, the war hadn't ended. It had simply changed shape. Now it lived in memories, in shadows that moved when the light shifted, in the way Jonas flinched at sudden sounds, in the hollow look Clara gave her when they crossed paths and said nothing. Thomas stayed. He didn't speak much of what he had seen. Neither did she. But sometimes they sat in silence, and it was enough. Other times they argued about nothing, about everything. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And after everything, that was a kind of peace too. Jonas grew. He read every letter Elena had kept, even the burned edges. Then one day, he started writing his own. Not to anyone in particular, just to remember. They planted a garden behind the barn. It struggled at first, but one spring morning, green shoots broke through the frost-bitten earth. Elena stood there, fingers in the soil, and felt something stir in her chest. Not joy, not yet, but something close. Some wounds never heal. Some promises are never forgotten. And some wars, they never truly end. But there are days simple, quiet, unexpected when survival feels like victory. And on those days, Elena lived. Years had passed. The war was no longer spoken of in whispers. It had become something distant, something studied, something buried in headlines and monuments. But in Elena's house, it still lived in drawers, in dreams. In the quiet way, Jonas said thank you after dinner. One afternoon, while organizing the barn, Jonas found a small wooden box. Inside it, a rusted Luger, a folded drawing of a woman and a boy, and a letter sealed and addressed to him. For when you're ready. He opened it alone, beneath the tree where he once learned to whistle. My sweet boy, it began. There was a time when I didn't know if I'd ever see you grow. I kept you hidden while soldiers searched the floors above. I lied, I bled. I kept walking when every part of me wanted to fall. Not for glory, not for revenge, but for you. She wrote about Thomas, about the night he ran, about the letter that brought him back, and about the love that stayed, even when everything else vanished. You are not the child of war, she wrote. You are the child of what came after. When Jonas finished reading, he didn't cry. He walked to the table and placed the letter in a frame, so that every day, when the world looked peaceful, he'd remember what peace cost and why it must never be taken for granted. The promise wasn't buried, it was passed on, and in that, it became eternal.